Good evening. Welcome again to the lecture by Sir Terry Farrell, CBE, a world-renowned, award-winning architect and planner from the UK. My name is Melanie Cheng, a Year 1 Master of Architecture student of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, we are greatly honored to have invited Sir Terry Farrell to deliver his lecture at our university campus. First of all, may I invite Professor Nelson Chen, Director of the School of Architecture, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Professor Chen, please.
Distinguished guests, faculty colleagues, students, alumni, and friends of the School of Architecture, a warm welcome to you all this evening. On behalf of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and our School of Architecture, we are very grateful and privileged for this special opportunity to hear in a few moments from Sir Terry Farrell, whose internationally acclaimed design work as an architect and planner should be well known to many of us in this audience. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to acknowledge the outstanding efforts this academic year by our school's Lectures and Exhibitions Committee, comprising our professors Patrick Huang, the coordinator, as well as Peter Ferretto, Stan Fong, and Francesco Rossini, with support from our staff in the general office. So my grateful thanks to them all. This past year, our fall lecture series featured HKIA award-winning projects as in-depth case studies, including recent work of Rocco Yim, Ronald Liu, Itis, and others. Then, our spring lecture series highlighted innovative, sustainable architecture throughout Asia by Woha in Singapore, Field Office in Taiwan, and Li Xiaodong in China, as well as our own Professor Christoph Krola on computational design and bamboo structures. Our most recent Kenosha lectures have been delivered by Pritzker Prize-winning architects last year, Jacques Herzog of Herzog and de Moron, and this year by Tom Main of Morphosis. Now this evening, our lecture series for this academic year culminates with a very special visit by Sir Terry Farrell, the renowned British architect and urban designer, whose many award-winning buildings and master plans include, in London, Embankment Place at Charing Cross Station, the Home Office headquarters, and the MI6 building. In China, high-speed railway stations in both Beijing and Guangzhou, and the KK 100 tower in Shenzhen. And here in Hong Kong, the Peak Tower, the firm's first project in Hong Kong, the British Consulate, and the M+ Museum in partnership with Herzog and de Moron and Arabs, now underway. From my own reading, there appear to be at least 3 recurrent themes that inform Sir Terry's work and career. First, his architecture and planning are always informed and inspired by context and place, especially in his designs for mixed-use urban complexes integrated with transport interchanges. These are projects that extend beyond iconic buildings to create iconic urban places. Second, there's a genuine commitment to working collaboratively across design disciplines. Sir Terry has championed the concept of design review panels to become reorganized and now known as place review panels, meaning P for planning, L for landscape, A for architecture, C for conservation, and E for engineering. Place. And actively to engage professionals from each of these fields. I think with architecture at the core, not leading from top down, but from within the center. And third, as an architect, he plays an important role in shaping cities, not only through designing buildings and urban plans, but also through public policy. For example, Sir Terry contributes greatly to important strategic issues as design advisor to the Mayor of London. And at the invitation of the British government, his firm publishes the Farrell Review of Architecture in the Built Environment. This is to offer expert professional guidance on British architecture and urban design. To me, what is most compelling is his achievement to carry out all this work so consistently over a professional career now spanning 5 decades, ever since his early partnership with Nicholas Grimshaw for 15 years before the founding of Farrell's in 1980. 2016 marks the 25th anniversary since the Hong Kong office of Farrell's was established. Throughout this time, Sir Terry Farrell has influenced the architectural field through the example of his professional work, as well as his dedication to addressing the challenging issues on what makes great cities. So on this special occasion that celebrates both the Golden Jubilee of his professional practice and the Silver Jubilee of the Farrell's office in Hong Kong, it is with great personal pleasure that I may introduce to you Sir Terry Farrell, who will speak on urban dialogue, the city as a tangled bank.
The talk I had suggested that I gave today is about a book, around a book I wrote about 2 or 3 years ago, The City as a Tangled Bank, which is about, it's taken from Charles Darwin, which I'll come to in a minute. And it's there's an amusing aside here that various people that thought that it was the story of the financial crisis of 2008-9 because it was about the City of London and a tangled bank, which was a financial irregularities at a bank. But it's nothing to do with that. It's to do with the city and how I believe, fundamentally believe, that it's a question of urban evolution as much as, if not more than, actual design. And the issue of design versus evolution is one that Charles Darwin picks up on. And it's been a big issue, particularly in America. Is nature, are we designed, or have we evolved? And the power of evolution is extraordinary. That the idea that you can have the human eye, you can have all of nature evolved through experimentation, through adaptation, is still beyond most people and my imagination that this could have happened over so long. But I believe very strongly that cities are not the product of design. They are much more the product of evolution. I always begin when I give a talk about, with this building, because it's like a moment of recognition, because it's the building that is in all the James Bond movies, and of course it keeps getting blown up. But I like the story that somebody told me. They were in a bus with a lot of school children early in the morning, and the school children all rushed to one side saying, "It's still there, it's still there." So I'm glad to tell you it is still there. But the building itself was part of a lot of master planning. It grew out of what's around it. It extends a river walk in front of it. We are working 20 years later with the local borough, which is the local government, on closing the gyratory, rebuilding the high street. It's all about placemaking, and it grew out of placemaking, and it has substantially led to placemaking. And that's the way I like to see buildings and cities. And the second building, and I will veer away from individual buildings to the city straight afterwards, is is the Embankment Place, or the building above Charing Cross Station. And this was also a very urban design interventionist project. We designed the park and relaid out the park. We relaid out the railway station below, because it sits in the air rights above a station. We relaid out the street. You can see the bottom right slide has a picture is of the adjacent street. So there are many facets to this building. And it led across to the South Bank, where I have been involved in remaster planning that for over 30 years. But to go back to the title of the talk, I'm very fond of reading Charles Darwin, Origin of Species. It is exceptionally well written. It is a wonderful piece of prose. If it didn't actually, in the course of that prose, actually explain and elucidate an idea that has been called very often the best idea ever. And I take this phrase, this paragraph, because it's at the very end of the book. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank. And for that, I read the city, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, various insects flitting about, worms crawling down earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and so dependent on each other, is so complex and in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. And I think that's a good analogy for the city. And then he ends with this statement, there is grandeur in this view of life. And I think that designers, and I'll come to that again and again through the talk, designers think that if you don't have the visual literacy of design, if you don't see planning and order in the city, then it must be chaotic. But the actual tangled bank is the opposite to chaotic. As Darwin said, everything is in its place and has evolved together. And that, in fact, is the city. If you look at any city, wherever it is on Earth, there is more apparent tangledness and apparent chaos than there is visual order or apparent order. I take the second quote from Jane Jacobs, and she is credited, the last line in this quotation, that cities which work well in some respects and badly in others, but she then goes on to say, without going at them, you can't go at a city without going at it as problems of organized complexity. And there is a lot of argument that justifies that she was the person that popularized this phrase, organized complexity. And she wrote about New York, of course, and about 50, 60 years ago. But she wrote about how architects seek very often, and designers seek very often, what she called a false order. It's a visual order, it's apparent order, but it is actually, she takes great pleasure and joy in the complexity that actually is the real order beneath it. And then also, I have written various things, but I talk about in this article in 76 that communities are a resource in an economic sense as well as in a socio-economic sense. And I often refer back to natural patterns. The tangled bank is difficult to get your mind around as a piece of organized, highly organized complexity in which there is grandeur in it. But we see something like a termite mound, and we see organized complexity. We see it's organized because it is self-organized, and it has taken millions of years, probably 30 million years of evolution, in which this extraordinary combination of the animal inside and the building and the way it functions, that it is partly food, it's partly heating, it has ventilation, it has extraordinary things that work with the habitat of the creature that's inside it. And I think just in the same way, I think that we have a DNA of habitat. When I look at a hospital or an airport, they begin to evolve into a town or a village. There is a DNA of human habitat, and so that hospitals are best planned with high streets, with squares, with residential districts, which are the wards, and residential districts, which are maybe the nurses' housing. But there is also, in a typical hospital, a morgue and a chapel. There are entry gates and so on. So they are like mini cities. And I think there is in us, just like there is in the termite, a sense of self-ordering, because we have grown ourselves and evolved ourselves in conjunction with our sense of habitat. And one forms the other, and one reflects the other. I was fascinated with these things when I was a student myself. These are drawings I did in the University of Pennsylvania, where I, without realizing it, drew diagrams of the city which are quite like termite mounds, that there is the underground system of the railways, the subway, there are elevators in the towers that take people to different floors, and so on. And we have organized these generically all and universally throughout the world, and this makes the cities what they are. And the termite mound is found, the analogy is found many times in our cities. This is a map of a drawing of the, which was called the stomach diagram, interestingly, because it looks like it's got all the intestines of a stomach, but the analogy with the termite mound is obvious. But whether you take a termite mound or you take a tangled bank, I think evolution takes a very strong role in cities. And I'll come back to this in a minute, the way the underground and subway system of the world have evolved. In about 2009, I was asked to do a special issue of Architectural Review. And I took on London, the Manifesto for London, I called it. And this takes patterns. Pattern recognition is extremely important in looking at this tangled bank. If the city is organized complexity, if it is a kind of a human version of a tangled bank, then there have to be ordered patterns in among it. And so I looked at London, and this is pedestrian underpasses. At each one of these red dots is where you go under the road to avoid the traffic. And I actually said, well, we should get rid of every one of these because they prioritize the traffic, the wheeled vehicles, and not the pedestrian on foot. And I saw other kind of patterns in this. For example, they only occur, these underpasses, where there are lots of pedestrians on the street. They're not actually, each of these red dots are not actually to protect the pedestrian. They're actually, with railings in London and underpasses, they're actually to keep the traffic flowing as quickly as possible. And that becomes, once you explain that, that's what the engineers had in mind, that's what the traffic transport people thought, then you begin to persuade politicians that this is, and city leaders, that this is not right, that there has to be a reprioritization. And if you take Marble Arch and at Hyde Park Corner and Park Lane, I've managed to campaign and close every one of those underpasses and get surface crossings. The reprioritization of the pedestrian and the vehicle is a key part of what makes a city. And the role of walking is crucial to what we call the public realm. This is a fascinating pair of diagrams. On the surface, you can see one story, which is the underground map 1926 in London was literal. It was laid out according to where the actual underground lines went. The Harry Beck and London Transport in 1933 created an abstract, a pattern recognition plan of London's underground, and immediately it became recognized, and this became the plan that survived, and indeed actually influenced the development of the railway lines and made it more popular, made travel easier, and actually, I think, influenced history and the future from 1933. And indeed, it is one that people carry a mental map of. It helps us understand the city. But the other thing that I was fascinated by is that the Underground Railway in London, which was the world's first, began as a very short thing, and it was just a convenient thing. It was a pragmatic invention. It ran from Baker Street to Farringdon and was in order to circumvent getting across the city from one mainline station to the place of work. And later on, they did another piece somewhere else. Then they did another piece. And gradually, people began to realize that these all connected up with each other. And they connected up in a pattern with the mainline stations above. And actually, the Circle line began as bits of straight independent lines that became, then suddenly realized, somebody realized afterwards, this could make a circle. And the Circle line wasn't invented, it kind of happened. It followed a pattern of self-ordering. And then when the map was produced for the London Underground, it became part of a recognition that this is a total system. And now the Mayor of London has a ticketing system that you can go from the Underground Railway to the main line, to the ferry boats, to the buses, and ticketing works much better with this pattern recognition, and it is, again, making public transport such that in London, for example, the number of people traveling by bus has doubled in the last 15 years, and the number of cars on the road have reduced, the number of car ownership has reduced by a third in that period of time. And I think this systematization, which is going on along with evolution rather than by design, by pattern recognition of what you've just done, I think is the key to how you plan cities. And that's very much what my belief is, that city planning is not a top-down designed exercise. It involves design, but it's as much from the bottom up, looking at what's going on there. Just like a doctor looks at a body, he didn't invent the body, he follows it. But he invents and he does wonderful surgery and amazing drugs that do all kinds of good things for the world today and prolongs life. But you're working with something that's in the nature of humankind, which happened by evolution. The human body evolved and didn't get designed as most of us all know, but there are those that prefer the explanation of design. This is roads. The roads are fairly chaotic in London, but the diagram bottom right is an extraordinary simple diagram, but follows the tube map. It shows the ring road that goes right around and begins to place order. And we've written various examples of inner ring roads and how the renewal is happening on that in a patterned way throughout the whole of London. This is I like to think this is a very British way of doing things. The French impose in Paris very strong patterns upon a random and evolved town. I often think Paris is a wonderful combination of evolution in the medieval sense and a superimposed order on top of it. And the French keep going because The whole of the center of Paris has no tall buildings except one. And all the tall buildings and the new developments are put on the outside. But the English way, the London way, has always been to work with the nature of things. And one of the most inspiring periods of British design, which worked with the grain, was the landscape period, the great landscape period, in which Capability Brown and then Humphrey Repton worked. And Repton, every time he designed a landscape, he had a little red book that showed before and after, before CGIs, before computer rendering, and you can just make out, in the top picture, there's a little flap, and the book turns over the flaps and reveals the evolution, the evolved landscape below. And I'll come back to Repton because he was very influential in city planning, because he was in partnership with John Nash when John Nash was doing the replanning a very large part of London. And this is Nash's plan for in 1812, where he planned very much of the West End. He planned he designed buildings. He's my hero, actually, because he designed buildings. He invented urban form from the urban plan. So he invented how you design facades, but let developers and contractors have freedom to do what's behind it. He invented palazzos in Regent's Park, which were actually hid lots of houses. And he also invented bungalows and small villas in Park Village East and Park Village West. But he planned this whole route and adapted it en route. He didn't do a houseman at all. Where land ownership was such that he couldn't assemble the land, he respected that and introduced curves and alterations and did keynote buildings along the route to tease the eye and take you spatially from one experience to another. In other words, he was doing in the city and in the town what Repton did in the countryside. You could say this is a little red book version of town planning. Not the little red book that you know from China, but he called it the little red book when he did the landscape Repton originally. I did this couple of a diagram. I like diagrams. I was trying to explain the difference between architecture and urbanism, and architects like to think of the tree of their building design as a perfect thing. In other words, like a human being or like a perfect bird. But habitat affects us all. There is no such thing as the perfect human being, which we now know from our DNA and from genes. We inherit things, we evolve in different ways, and different races evolve different ways and different illnesses and so on. But nevertheless, architects very often start off by designing the perfect building. And the trees on the top are all you could see a metaphor or analogy to buildings. This is the mind's eye of the designer, that they see the perfect tree. The reality is, when you place the tree in the city, as in the bottom picture, it is more like a woodland. And in fact, the trees all become one big tree. The edge trees grow one-sided, the center trees don't grow branches at the bottom. But the great prize is that you get this rich habitat underneath it. And you were all familiar with architects telling the photographer not to get any people in the photograph of the building. But I think that buildings and great architecture is such as in Florence, such as in medieval towns, are often come out and arise from their context as much as they do from the purity of the design idea. I've got a couple of slides here which I think summarize how architects have a self-perception. There are buildings in Britain called Maggie centres, which are very worthwhile and very good cancer recovery centres. They're clearly, they don't have operating theatres, they don't have medicine. They're merely, I say merely, but they're a place to go for contemplation, for escape, and to enable cancer patients undergoing treatment to have a place of quiet. And the program is run by a well-known architect and critic and landscaper, Charles Jenks, in memory of his wife, Maggie. I designed their house for them with him as a collaborator 35 years ago. But these buildings, to me, summarize an awful lot about the way architects see design as distinct from the real habitat of mankind. Because up above it is a hospital. It's Dundee Hospital, and in the little red ring is a building that's won many, many awards by Frank Gehry. And this, to my mind, the architects invariably design the perfect tree or the perfect building, but the hospital itself may have started off with some kind of order, but you can see there's car parking everywhere, little groups, and where is the front door? And there was some order originally, but then additions and adaptations have taken place. And actually, most hospitals in the UK are pretty disorganized and rather shameful places in architectural terms. But architects and designers tend to turn their back on that because it's too big a problem. It's like the city. And you can make a perfect Maggie Centre to one side. And this is one in London. This is this in the red circle again to one side of the main hospital. Very organized, wonderful. It won the Sterling Prize. It's by Richard Rogers and his firm. And it sits to one side. It's clean. It's separate. But in the meantime, there is this jumble of the hospital itself and this disorganized nature of a hospital. I wrote a book probably nearly 10 years ago now about shaping London and about how you do actually tackle the city from an evolutionist standpoint. Where does design sit when you're looking at evolution? How do you nudge? How do you pattern search for what is in the tangle bank? How do you actually find where to intercept? Rather than make a perfect piece of city, why not actually engage with the city all around you and try to influence things like the underpasses, like pedestrian crossings, like railway stations, like tube systems. And I like to engage with what is the 99% of the habitat of the city rather than make a personal, perfect thing to one side. And so I explained, and this diagram illustrates it, that the first stage is the landscape. Of course, everything begins with landscape. Then, of course, there's roads and infrastructure. Then there are places, Chelsea, Brompton, Belgravia, and so on. And then there's buildings. And I think this order summarizes for me the order in which all architects and all designers should approach city making and also building design. I love Google Maps. I'm a bit of a nerd for Google Maps. I can spend hours looking at Google Maps. They're extraordinarily revealing. This is a map of an area of Westminster with Buckingham Palace right at the centre top. And I've been working a lot on the space in front of it. it was a traffic island. We now have a square in front of it, and I'm in favor of it becoming more of a square. There's another square here called Parliament Square, and there is another one there that is called Trafalgar Square. And those three squares actually are a wonderful example of self-ordering, because around the Buckingham Palace are all the houses of the royal family up here, and other palaces like St. James's Palace and so on. Around this square, Parliament Square, it is church and state, so you get Westminster Abbey, which is the church bit. You get the House of Parliament here. But the very order in which you get the buildings, this one is the Treasury. Closest to Parliament is the money. Next is the Foreign Office, which fitted the idea of Britain and its empire once upon a time. But the Queen relates to, right centrally here is Horse Guards, because she's head of the military, and around it goes the Ministry of Defence. This Trafalgar Square is the People's Square. I then did this diagram, which summarizes that, so that you get Trafalgar Square, Parliament Square, and Buckingham Palace. And often people say that we don't have a constitution in the UK, and it's true. But actually, if you look at this map, you see more evidence of a constitution than you ever would from words. I think it's an extraordinary example of self-ordering. I did these probably 15, nearly 20 years ago when we first came to Hong Kong. This is London and Hong Kong to the same scale. They are about the same density. The top two diagrams show London and Hong Kong where the people are, and the lower one shows where the green spaces are. And you can see immediately that the mountainous areas of Hong Kong are not built upon, whereas London is flat and it's spread out. And you can devise all kinds of other patterns from these two patterns. Like, for example, in Hong Kong, you have a very efficient public transport system because you can only build on narrow corridors, narrow ribbons of land. So you have a very, very good diagram, inadvertently, because the mountains you can't build upon, to get a very profit-making, I gather, and efficient public transport. But London is so spread out that if you're in those outer suburbs, you have a real problem about catching a bus. You have a real problem of where you're, how you get hierarchy, which all transport systems need. And the bottom two is when people say to me from Britain who haven't come here, they say, what is Hong Kong like? It seems a very dense urban place. I say, no, it's very like Scotland, only subtropical, because most of Hong Kong is mountains and water, just like Scotland. And our people don't know really, they can't register that, but the diagrams show it all. I Google Earth and Hong Kong, the patterns. You can also see patterns in the visual form. Hong Kong has lots of little ownerships, and you can see that in the pencil towers. Shanghai has got bigness. It's got big motorways. It's also got just juxtaposition of Old Town and New Town. You can see a lot in the photographs that I just took out of the hotel windows where I was staying. I did a diagram some 20 years ago that explains one interpretation of buildings in Hong Kong. And the little diagram on the top right, I noted A, B, and C. If you build on the top, like the peak, it's in silhouette. It's very prominent. You can see the houses there. And of course, you can see the peak building. And I designed the peak competition entry on a postcard of Hong Kong. And I wanted it to look across the harbour. It was from Tsim Sha Tsui, and it was right across the other harbour side. And I drew this thing that you could see from the other side of the harbour. And that's how I interpreted the mountaintop. There is, in C, there is the landfill and the flat plain of the harbour's edge. And we have a building there, which is the KVB, the ventilation building for the tunnel, for the harbour tunnel, for the rail. And then there is B, which is the mid-levels, which is a windy road running along the contour. And each of those three, we've had a great opportunity to build in the 1990s. So there's the Peak, the KVB ventilation building, but the one I particularly invested a huge amount of energy and thought into was the British Consulate, which it celebrates the mid-level contour. The road winds along it so that it enables the British Consulate in B, in the diagram, to look one way, and the British Council building to look another way. They have two totally separate faces, and the photograph at the top is the British Council, and the photograph at the bottom left is the consulate. And then I separated out the two buildings, but combined them with a common entry point, which is at F, and they are the gaps between the two buildings. We did the Kowloon Station, the West Kowloon, which is the most complex three-dimensional master plan just about anywhere in the world. And we are now doing with Herzog's the building in front of it, in the landfill in front of it, which is very much based upon the ground level. But what fascinated me about this was that we did a competition design for the arts quarter, for the Kowloon Arts Centre, and we based it on a street. We returned it to what I think is the DNA of Habitat. People recognize streets. And we did this scheme in 2010 as part of the long list that was shortlisted. Norman Foster's, 3 years later, unveiled a scheme with a street down the middle. And I'm sure he came up with the idea first, but it was 3 years later. And there are buildings and plots along it. And it's very different from this first scheme, because this first design was a single big building. It was big architecture. It was urban planning as big architecture, which I think rarely ever works because it has problems with phasing, problems with adaptability. The street and building plots along it is part of the way we see the world. I was also very much influenced by Beijing and the story there, that we did a design for the upper part is our design. That is our entry for the Beijing Opera House. And we made it space positive, so it enclosed a square, it respected, and we did a plan that showed how the whole of that complex outside the Imperial Palace Forbidden City could develop in time. But the one that was chosen was Paul Andrews, which is not, it's object positive. It sits in space. It treats the spaces around it as totally fluid and not enclosing. And our building itself, well, you can see it's a rectilinear. It faces, it has a front, it has a road, it respects streets, it respects squares. The Paul Andrews scheme was an object in space. And I don't believe that that was the way Beijing either did happen and is happening, or the area around it, what is the future of that. Now I'll come back to London. Like most cities in the world, we are in the century of city making. This is an extraordinary phenomena that we are making cities in this century, the 21st century. London is in the top 20 of size of cities, but it will not be in the top 100 by the end of this century. But nevertheless, the growth is extraordinary. We have added since 2010 a city the size of Edinburgh to London. By 2025, we'll add a Birmingham, and that isn't just houses and flats, that's also hospitals and schools and roads. I've recently looked at figures, and I have to amend this diagram, because by 2050, according to projections, we will add a whole country. We'll add Scotland to the size of London, which is an extraordinary thought. Mostly by childbirth, by people living longer with old age, so childbirth is first, living longer is second. The third one is a disaggregation of households. There are more and more single people. There are more people expecting to live on their own at a younger age. There are more elderly people living on their own. But the fourth one is migration. And I think most people think it's migration, but it isn't. It's actually the other factors. And how do you deal with this? Well, I always like to come up with big plans and big ideas. And one that's around at the moment is making London a national park city. And this isn't an anti-growth. It actually ensures that landscape goes hand in hand with growth. For example, we found statistically there are 8 million trees and 8 million people living in London. So a very simple idea is every time the population goes up, you plant a tree. So that by 2050, there may be 12 million people in London. There should be 12 million trees. These are very simple pattern recognition things. Intensifying the core, create new town centres around transport hubs, and finally, one that I'll touch on a bit more is East London growth. With this diagram shows bridges on the east of London. And we've suggested that the docks are empty, the river traffic has hugely reduced, but if you're going to put 1 million people there, you've got to get across the river. And at the moment, the river is in the authority of the Port of London, which still imagines grandiosely that the docks are full of trading ships, which they're not. The docks are full of housing and businesses. So I think the first priority is not high-level bridges, but lift bridges that prioritize what's the neighborhoods that live either side, the spontaneous interaction between the banks, which is, treats the Port of London is a hangover from a past pattern from an earlier age. And it's treating the river like a highway, as though, and they get income. The only revenue the Port of London gets is from river traffic, and they're hanging on to it for dear life. But actually, they should get some money from residences at along the banks. And these villages and small towns will benefit from immediate construction of low-level bridges. And just similarly, a road can be a great divider too. And nobody plans roads. So I took a road, a Marylebone Euston Road, and I did a plan for it with crossings and so on. And I looked at this intersection, and I redesigned it, and this is what now exists. And I looked along it, and I identified that there are 10 times more people walking along the sides of the road than there are in the vehicles. So it needs 10 times reprioritization. If you look at the traffic lights, they don't favor the pedestrians, they favor the cars. I don't propose that pedestrian lights go for 10 times longer than the cars, because London would snarl up. But on the other hand, at the moment, it's something like 100 to 1 in terms of bias towards the wheeled vehicles. And I identified all the major buildings along it. I made a catalogue of these, and I opened people's eyes, I hope, to the fact that this wasn't a traffic street, it was a place street. And along it, there are parish churches. There are 8 restaurants with outdoor cafes on this busy road. And we subsequently were commissioned to look at one of the island sites, and we designed 3 buildings there, which are these 3 here, with a John Soane church in the middle. We master planned all the rest of it, but we succeeded in getting new pedestrian crossings here, and here, and here. And I'm very proud of the public domain and the way markets and events happen inside this. We designed the buildings. This is the architecture we did. And this is a building that contains residential, all part of the same complex. But the one I will finish with, and epitomizes my approach to architecture, is there was a very, on the top right is what used to exist in 3 tower blocks, a perfect Corbusian diagram with a podium that reached across the whole of the 2 blocks. The buildings themselves were very small floor plate. They were very uneconomic. They could have still been there had the technology started to fail and the cladding began to fall off and the concrete began to spoil. So we designed the new, we set an agenda which was an urban agenda. This had been a government headquarters building and the 3 towers and the podium. Nobody could enter it, top security, but we gave ourselves an agenda of permeability. So if you see the bottom scheme there, there are pedestrian routes going through here and through here that connect to adjacent streets. There is housing, so we put housing, there are shopping, and there are creches and so on. But what's most interesting is that this scheme that we built that replaced the demolished buildings has actually got 10% more floor area, which is astonishing. It actually has bigger floor plates for the offices. The 3 buildings along the front of Marshall Street are the same floor area, but we managed to add housing, creches, shops, and so on. And I like to think this is urban design at the macro scale and urban design at the internal scale. So this diagram shows what I like to think of as the habitat, natural habitat, so that we have 3 big floor plates. We have a street that bridges over the pedestrian routes. We have squares, which are the atriums, the 3 atriums. We have shops, and which you have. This is a working population of 5,000 people. So it has shops, it has coffee places, and little snack bars, and the main restaurant. Each of the 3 town squares has a thematic basis. So one is an eats square, one is a quiet library laptop square, and the central one is a public square with gathering where the minister often addresses all the staff and so on. And I think this is about urban design first, internally and externally, and architecture takes a back seat. But when it came to the expression of the architecture, we turned to artists, and we had 15 different artists, including an artist that we work with, who we collaboratively on the canopy at the front and the big screen, big and small. So there's very, very small elements of art that you could miss. And in fact, one of the most invisible is a handrail that we had to put in for means of wheelchair access. And an artist designed the handrail with prisms. But the biggest spectacular thing is the canopy in multicolors. And when the sun shines in the right way, it colors all the street and all the building. And it used to be called Marshall Street, but the locals now call it Rainbow Street. And this shows the Rainbow Street, bottom left, and it shows the pedestrian routes through and the bridges above, so that you get the internal urban design, the external urban design working together. This is the artist, Liam Gillett. For the same price as the sunscreens, louvers, we got the art, and a little bit more, but we got the art which identifies the entrance area, which is always used for TV interviews with the minister from the Home Office. He's always in trouble, as any Home Office minister is. And they like this very much as the backdrop. Liam invented the idea that this is based upon town maps. So these are lots of different maps of cities. And this is the interior with the streets. And so I will end there. Basically, it's an approach to architecture. It's an approach which recognizes flamboyance when you need it, such as the peak. But most of all, I think most buildings have to take their urban setting as their first starting point, and the landscape. Landscape first, urban setting place comes second, and I think architecture and architecture expression fits those two, but grows out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Terry Farrell, for sharing your words of wisdom. Please remain on stage. Sir Terry has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. Now, may I invite Professor Nelson Chen to come forward and conduct the questions and answers session. Professor Chen, please.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions, raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. Professor Lovell.
I have a question that sort of ties the Hong Kong and London elements together. As a Londoner that's living in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong being, I think I'm right in saying, the highest density of tall buildings together. I think that statistic still stands. Currently in London on the planning books, there's a plethora of towers proposed that will radically change the skyline of London. It's a very different place to this place, and has evolved, as you've really beautifully described today, in a very different way for different landform reasons, primarily. I just wanted to know what your opinion is about all the towers that are currently planned for London. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I will duck the question because it is a thing, and it is happening, and it will happen. Just as maybe 150, 200 years ago, people would say, we don't want any railways, and there were people campaigning against railways. I'm not a progress hunter at all costs. One of the things that interests me most about London is it's doing tall buildings in a very different way. It's polycentric, is London. It's completely the opposite to Hong Kong. It's completely the opposite to Manhattan. What's happening, the tall buildings in London, is that they are grouping around railway stations. They're grouping around tube stations in outer areas. They're grouping around transport centers. And if you look at a map of, look at a diagram of Manhattan and Paris, they both have similar but opposite characteristics. Manhattan has a hugely dense center and a sprawling outer area, but it is a donut. Paris has the reverse. It has a very low center and a very high build around the perimeter. London has always been different. It's been I like to characterize London by saying it went from a collection of villages and towns, all dispersed around the countryside, to a metropolis without the intervening stages of being a city. Whereas Paris is, and most European cities have a very great sense of the civic and togetherness. London is always valued dispersal. And indeed, all the parks and the open spaces are dispersed, but so are the centers of these communities. And I often take analogy with Christopher Wren and his time. After the fire of London, there were lots of people said, you must come up with a designed, planned model. And the two that gained most attention and most traction among the the politician leaders and the architects were, one was the Paris model, big diagonals, boulevards that all focused on one point, which was St. Paul's, or Bank, so it was money and the church. And the other one was a grid. There was a proposal for the grid, which is a New York pattern. What actually was built has been described by many architects as being happen chance and no plan. Actually, it had an integral plan to it. It was community-based. And when you look at the Canaletto paintings of London, you see each parish church defines the community. And in each parish church, which Wren did a lot of them, but he didn't do all of them, is a market, is a little village meeting point, and so on. And I think we are seeing London today as a bigger version of that. And I don't think that our generation can say that it's a bad or good thing. I think it's how it's done. This is the nature of London. I supported the Shard. I thought it was a good building and a good location. It regenerated that station. I opposed Renzo Piano's tower at Paddington for the same consistency reasons. There are places to put towers. What I criticize London for at the moment, it has no, we don't have a real development control system. We call it that. But actually, the most interesting thing about the Shard is that it was on nobody's plan. No, the tallest building in Europe wasn't designated in this age of town planning to be the tallest, any size of building. And the trouble is we have total freedom for the individual to do whatever they like. And I think the French model goes the other way. It's total control. I think there's something in between. I think the nature of cities is that you have to go with what's happening, but you have to recognize the patterns, and you have to then make sure all of the polycentric places have got good public realm, that the tower blocks are extremely well designed, but I wouldn't say that it's a good or bad thing. It is what's happening. We're adding a whole Scotland by 2050.
Terry, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to go back to your very first reference to Charles Darwin, which indeed is obviously very powerful for you and very powerful as a way of presenting a lecture. But I kept on thinking the implications in terms of the non-intentional nature of evolution, this extraordinary proposition that Charles Darwin was the first one to make, and which people like Stephen Dawkins recently, or more recently, emphasized. It's the work of a blind watchmaker. In other words, all the major transformations in evolution were non-intentional. The giraffe doesn't grow a longer neck because it needs to grow a longer neck to reach leaves on the top of trees. It eventually, after generation, those mutations that produced longer necks made those who had longer necks survive longer and therefore reproduce, etc. So the extraordinary philosophical implication of evolution is that the major changes which have allowed survival have been non-intentional. So my question to you is, how could that actually inform us in relation to what the future city might be? Could it be that the really significant changes to the city in the future could happen not out of design, not out of any volition on the part of us and architects and urbanists and politicians, but actually accidental? How could that be? How would you respond to that question? And can I maybe rephrase it? The most important element that has transformed cities has been, you could say, has been the invention of the internal combustion engine. The man who invented the internal combustion engine had no intention of changing the shape of cities. It is a very, very unintentional byproduct, but a phenomenal one. So my question to you is, to rephrase it, do you think that if this belief in evolution leads us to think, or does it lead us to think that maybe the major transformations of the cities in the future may happen accidentally or may come from non-intentional changes?
Well, I would first of all counter that by saying, actually, cities are largely unintentional phenomena. There are very few examples of intentional city planning being metropolitan-wide. But let me come back to Charles Darwin and your main point. I think that when Charles Darwin and others around his time made the observation or discovery that evolution was at work, there became a time of increased self-awareness, which we can no longer, having discovered that, we can no longer proceed in any other way but knowing that that has happened. And I think that it's gone in parallel with the Anthropocene in that we dominate nature. Now nature is we are influencing evolution. We are now changing the species, the habitats, including our own, but the nature of the air, the pollution, the seas, and so on. So I think the answer for us is not to ignore design, but to see design's place in all this. We can no longer be like the giraffe who is ignorant of why he's got his long neck and proceeds whatever he does do and thinks it's nice to have a long neck because he can eat the leaves. But the reality is that every time I approach a building now, with that knowledge plugged into my head that it is an evolution, that a process that we have, and then design in that, with that knowledge, then you have a different kind of solution. I think it grows out of knowing the phenomena you're dealing with, rather than being a superimposition of the era of the Renaissance, where we were not dominating nature, and so you could come up with, and the Greeks and the Romans, you could come up with ideal cities, but we are now dealing with the world as a city, and therefore we have to recognize the interconnectivity of everything. And so you can't actually put a building up without affecting the climate, without affecting all kinds of other aspects of things. So I think it's a degree of self-knowledge that you can, once it's there, you can never do without it. I'm fascinated by planned cities. We've been involved in replanning Milton Keynes, and Milton Keynes was a planned city on grids, and there was a concept of the layer, the hierarchy of roads and so on. But over time, human habitat's taken over. And what's happened to Milton Keynes, as I understand it in Brasilia and elsewhere, there are ghettos, there are fun areas, there are which the planners didn't and the designers didn't intend. It's reverting back to human habitat. And I think we have to recognize that there is the nature of human habitat, this tendency to always go in a certain direction. I'm not answering it very well, but anyway, I'll discuss it with you later.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question is sort of related to what you just said about Milton Keynes. Cities are often considered as humankind's most greatest creation. And cities evolve, and that's why cities are interesting, because they evolve organically. But planners these days are often asked to build new towns.
Do you ask what?
New towns.
Oh, yes.
Planners, now we need to build new towns, and often these new towns are built on greenfield sites. There's no community or local community to speak of to sort of adopt this kind of bottom-up approach in planning the new town. So what would you do if you were asked to do a new town now on a greenfield site? How would you ensure it has the kind of design and diversity that most old towns, if you like, have?
Well, you can't invent age. And I think I've been, Milton Keynes is a new town, and I referred to that. But also, I've master planned greenfield universities, 50 years old, University of Kent, University of Kiel. And you can see over 50 years, they began to mutate or evolve or something to the natural habitat of people. And they've accreted, adaptation has been the style or the foremost piece of design. If I was asked to do a new town, which occasionally parts of what I do are not quite new towns, but I think that you would design it in the knowledge, first of all, that this won't be forever. Whatever you plan has to be able to change and be flexible. That everybody's plan for a new town in the past, Brasilia, Milton Keynes, assumed that was the order. And in fact, if you revisit now, other things have happened. Time has gone on, demand has changed, motor cars have increased or decreased or whatever. And there is a pattern in this that if you see London before the invention of the motor car, the streets were just as congested. They were full of horses. And the traffic in London travels at 18 miles an hour today, average, and that's what it traveled before the invention of the motor car. It traveled at 18 miles an hour. So there are patterns in all these things, and I think all I'm saying is it's not humility, but it is definitely not arrogance. And the arrogance of the designer often is, I don't know whether it's in this architecture school, but there are many architects that become convinced that they can change the world permanently forever and their work will last forever, particularly in urban planning and city making. Their building may last forever, but do they really? Buildings transform. My favorite two buildings as pieces of architecture today are the St. Pancras Station, which has evolved to 1/3 of the people that go to St. Pancras Station go there for other reasons than to catch a train. It's become a town centre. It's become a great hall. It's become what in medieval times was the marketplace. The other one is the great mosque in Cordoba, where there was a set of Roman buildings. These were taken over by the Muslims to make a mosque, reusing the columns. And they came in all different heights, so they invented a pointed arch that could actually adjust and reuse these wonderful Roman columns. Then the Christians took it over the mosque, and they built a cathedral in the middle, and they made all their little aisles, little chapels. And it sits in the Jewish quarter, so you have all the major religions of the Western world, including the Roman pagan ones, all in one building. And I think that, for me, it is also a most magnificent building. And I quite like that. I was on English Heritage for a long time, and we kept finding reuses for masterpieces. And they're all reused. Everything's reused and changes. All the major monuments of the world will no longer end up in the use and order that you thought. In UK, we're all busy trying to think of reuses for churches and cathedrals because nobody goes to church anymore, or nothing like as many as they did. But then the buildings are wonderful. So how do you match patterns of today to patterns of the past? That's a really interesting design exercise.
Thank you, Sir Terry Farrell and Professor Chen. Would Sir Terry please continue to remain on stage? To express our appreciation, may I invite Professor Chen to present a souvenir to Sir Terry Farrell.